The story unfolds in Chicago, Illinois, in the fragile years that followed the end of World War I, a period when the United States was still absorbing the psychological weight of a conflict that had taken more than 116,000 American lives overseas. The year was 1919, and although the cannons had fallen silent in Europe the year before, the echoes of the war still reverberated through American cities, families, and institutions. Chicago, one of the nation's fastest-growing and most influential urban centers, felt an urgent need to transform grief into remembrance. Civic leaders, veterans organizations, and politicians converged around a powerful idea: to build a monumental structure that would eternally honor the soldiers who had marched into battle and never returned. This vision did not begin as a simple sports venue. From its earliest conception, the project carried a sacred and commemorative purpose. The city proposed the construction of what was initially known as Municipal Grant Park Stadium, a name that reflected its civic roots and its location along the scenic edge of Lake Michigan. The chosen site was not accidental. Grant Park had long served as a symbolic gathering ground for the city, a place of public ceremonies, military parades, political rallies, and collective expression. By situating the stadium there, Chicago was embedding remembrance into the very heart of its public life. As planning advanced in the early 1920s, the project gained momentum and solemn gravity. The architectural firm Holabird and Roche, already respected for their influence on Chicago's skyline, was entrusted with the design. Their vision departed sharply from the utilitarian stadiums of the era. Instead of prioritizing comfort or commercial appeal, they drew inspiration from ancient Roman architecture, particularly the grandeur of classical colonnades and open ceremonial spaces. The result was a structure that resembled a temple more than an arena, a deliberate choice meant to evoke reverence, sacrifice, and permanence. By the time construction progressed, the name had evolved into Soldier Field, a title that left no ambiguity about its purpose. Every stone, every column, and every axis of the stadium was infused with symbolism. The imposing Doric columns that framed the structure stood like silent sentinels, reminiscent of soldiers standing at attention. The vast open field at its center mirrored parade grounds where troops once assembled before deployment. Even the scale of the stadium, capable of holding tens of thousands, reflected the magnitude of loss the nation had endured. The stadium was officially inaugurated on October 9, 1924, during a ceremony steeped in military ritual and patriotic solemnity. Veterans attended in uniform, flags were raised, and speeches echoed across the lakefront, invoking honor, duty, and memory. For many present, the occasion was deeply emotional. It was not merely the opening of a new public venue, it was the dedication of a national shrine. The air was thick with remembrance, as if the ghosts of fallen soldiers lingered invisibly among the crowd. Yet from its very beginning, Soldier Field carried an atmosphere unlike any other stadium in America. While crowds would later gather there to cheer, celebrate, and compete, the land itself was marked by mourning. It had been shaped by the intent to remember death rather than victory, sacrifice rather than triumph. This dual identity, both memorial and arena, created a subtle tension that would define the stadium for decades to come. Few spectators in later years paused to consider this origin. For most fans, Soldier Field became synonymous with football, particularly after it became the longtime home of the Chicago Bears. But beneath the roar of the crowd and the clash of helmets, the stadium's foundation told a quieter, heavier story. It was built not to entertain, but to commemorate. Not to distract from pain, but to preserve it. The location along Lake Michigan further deepened this symbolism. The lake, vast and often unforgiving, mirrored the unknown oceans crossed by American soldiers heading to war. Its winds swept across the stadium with a chilling persistence, especially during late-season games, earning Soldier Field a reputation as one of the coldest and most brutal venues in professional football. To some, this was merely a climatic challenge. To others, it felt like an extension of the stadium's somber character, as if the environment itself resisted comfort. Historically, the surrounding area had hosted military drills, memorial services, and national celebrations, reinforcing the connection between mass gatherings and collective identity. Long before football crowds filled the stands, the grounds had witnessed formations of troops, solemn ceremonies honoring the dead, and speeches meant to unify and mobilize the public. Soldier Field did not interrupt this tradition. It absorbed it. Over time, whispers began to circulate among players, staff, and longtime observers. Subtle remarks about the weight of the place, the unusual tension felt on the field, the inexplicable struggles faced by teams that called it home. While such notions were often dismissed as superstition, they persisted, passed quietly from generation to generation. Some wondered whether a structure born from grief could ever truly become a place of joy. Whether one believes in energies, symbolism, or the psychological power of place, one fact remains undeniable. Soldier Field was never just a stadium. It was conceived as a living monument, shaped by war, memory, and national trauma. Its walls were raised not in celebration, but in remembrance. And from the moment its gates first opened in 1924, the echoes of distant battlefields seemed to settle into the soil beneath the turf. Thus, long before touchdowns, championships, or legendary athletes defined its legacy, Soldier Field had already been marked by history. The war had ended, but its shadow remained, etched into stone, carried by the wind off Lake Michigan, and woven permanently into the identity of one of America's most iconic sporting landmarks. The arrival of the Chicago Bears at Soldier Field marked a turning point not only in the history of the franchise, but in the very identity of the stadium itself. To understand how a solemn war memorial slowly transformed into one of the most emotionally charged venues in professional football, it is necessary to return to the early days of the National Football League, when the sport was still searching for legitimacy, structure, and a place in American culture. In 1920, at a time when professional football was often dismissed as a rough, disorganized pastime, a man named George Stanley Halas emerged as a central figure in shaping the future of the game. Born in Chicago in 1895, Halas was not only a player and coach, but also a visionary businessman and strategist. That year, he helped found a team originally known as the Decatur Staleys, which soon relocated to Chicago and in 1922 adopted the name Chicago Bears. Halas believed that football could rival baseball as America's national sport, and he was determined to anchor his team in a city that symbolized industrial power, resilience, and ambition. As the Bears grew in popularity throughout the 1920s, they played in several venues, including Wrigley Field, but the connection to Soldier Field gradually became inevitable. By the early 1930s, the monumental stadium on the shores of Lake Michigan began hosting Bears games more frequently, until it ultimately became their spiritual and symbolic home. What had been conceived as a memorial to fallen soldiers now echoed with the sounds of cheering crowds, marching bands, and the violent collisions of a young and brutal sport. At first, the transformation felt triumphant. Football brought life, noise, and celebration to a place born from mourning. Fans packed the stands during cold Chicago afternoons, wrapped in heavy coats, their breath visible in the air. George Halas himself often stood on the sidelines, bundled against the wind, his sharp eyes scanning the field with military discipline. Under his leadership, the Bears became one of the NFL's earliest dynasties, winning championships in 1921, 1932, 1933, 1934, 1937, and 1940. On paper, Soldier Field appeared to be a stage for glory. Yet beneath the surface, subtle disturbances began to emerge. By the early 1930s, whispers circulated quietly among players, trainers, and stadium employees. These were not stories shared with the press or shouted in locker rooms, but murmured late at night or exchanged in low voices during long road trips. Some players spoke of an unexplained heaviness that seemed to settle over them the moment they entered the stadium. Others described sudden waves of fatigue during games, even when they were in peak physical condition. In the locker rooms, especially those located deeper within the structure, players reported persistent sensations of discomfort. Several claimed they felt dizzy or nauseous for no medical reason. Trainers noticed that minor injuries took longer than expected to heal, and that muscle strains and joint problems appeared with unusual frequency. While football was always a violent sport, veterans began to remark that Soldier Field felt different, less forgiving, more draining. Security guards and night staff had their own experiences. During late shifts, when the stadium was empty and the wind from Lake Michigan howled through the colonnades, some guards reported hearing footsteps echoing through deserted corridors, even when no one else was present. Others spoke of voices, indistinct, muffled, as if carried from far away, emanating from the lower levels of the stadium. These accounts were often dismissed as imagination, fatigue, or the natural acoustics of a massive stone structure. Still, the stories persisted. What unsettled many observers was not a single dramatic incident, but a pattern. As the Bears competed in critical games throughout the 1930s, strange coincidences began to form around key dates. Important matchups and championship runs were occasionally followed by tragic events off the field. Players suffered sudden personal losses. Accidents involving relatives or close associates surfaced with disturbing timing. In a few cases, individuals connected to the organization died unexpectedly, their deaths quickly overshadowed by the momentum of the season and quietly omitted from public narratives. The media of the era, still closely tied to team owners and league officials, rarely pursued these stories. The NFL itself was fighting for survival and respectability, and controversy was considered a threat. As a result, an unspoken culture of discretion began to take shape. Journalists focused on scores, heroes, and championships, while uncomfortable details were pushed aside. This atmosphere of silence allowed rumors to remain rumors, never confirmed, never denied. Inside league circles, however, Soldier Field began to earn a reputation. Executives, referees, and visiting teams quietly acknowledged that the stadium felt emotionally oppressive. Visiting players sometimes remarked that they struggled to find energy during games there, even when conditions were similar to other outdoor venues. Referees spoke of an unusual tension in decisive moments, as if the air itself grew heavier during critical plays. No one used words like curse or haunting in official conversations, but phrases such as a difficult place or a heavy building became common. George Halas himself was known to be a deeply disciplined and pragmatic man, not prone to superstition. Yet even he acknowledged, in private conversations later recalled by associates, that Soldier Field carried a unique psychological weight. Whether he attributed this to the stadium's memorial origins, its brutal weather conditions, or something more intangible, he never said publicly. What mattered to Halas was winning, and for many years the Bears did exactly that. By 1940, when the Bears delivered one of the most dominant performances in NFL history with a 73-0 victory over the Washington Redskins in the NFL championship game, Soldier Field stood as both a symbol of triumph and contradiction. The stadium had witnessed unparalleled success, yet it was also steeped in stories of discomfort, loss, and unease. It was as if victory came at an invisible cost. As the decade closed, and the world once again moved toward global conflict with the onset of World War II, the identity of Soldier Field felt eerily complete. A stadium born from the memory of war, now hosting a team forged in physical combat, stood quietly watching history repeat itself. The lines between memorial and battleground, between sport and sacrifice, had blurred. By the time the Bears entered the 1940s, Soldier Field was no longer just their home. It had become a presence, silent, massive, and emotionally charged. To the fans, it was a cathedral of football. To those who worked behind the scenes, it was something more complex, shaped by history, loss, and an accumulation of moments that refused to fade. The rumors that emerged during those early decades never truly disappeared. They lingered, passed from generation to generation, woven into the folklore of the franchise. And as the years went on, many would come to wonder whether the echoes of the past, of soldiers, of sacrifice, of unspoken tragedies, had ever truly left the corridors of Soldier Field. As the decades advanced and the National Football League evolved from a regional curiosity into one of the most powerful sports empires on the planet, Soldier Field remained firmly planted at the center of this transformation. By the time the 1950s arrived, professional football was no longer just a game played on muddy fields for modest crowds. It had become a national spectacle fueled by television contracts, corporate sponsorships, and political influence. And in Chicago, beneath the towering columns of Soldier Field, the convergence of power, money, and secrecy quietly took shape. The post-war years marked a turning point for American society. After World War II, the United States entered an era of economic expansion, mass media growth, and institutional consolidation. The NFL rode this wave with remarkable precision. Under commissioners like Bert Bell, who served from 1946 until his death in 1959, the league focused on competitive balance, television exposure, and centralized authority. These changes laid the groundwork for unprecedented profitability. Soldier Field, already steeped in symbolism and history, became not only a venue for iconic games, but also a strategic asset within this expanding business machine. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the Chicago Bears remained one of the league's most storied franchises, still closely associated with the legacy of George Halas, who continued to exert influence until his death in 1983. Halas was more than an owner or coach. He was a political operator within the league, a man who understood that football decisions were inseparable from economics and power. Meetings between Bears executives, NFL officials, and city authorities increasingly took place far from press rooms and locker rooms, often behind closed doors in offices overlooking Grant Park or in private dining rooms scattered across downtown Chicago. At the heart of many of these discussions was Soldier Field itself. The stadium, owned by the city of Chicago, required constant maintenance and modernization to keep pace with a league that was rapidly embracing luxury boxes, broadcast technology, and corporate branding. Yet any change to Soldier Field was complicated by its status as a historic memorial. This tension created fertile ground for quiet negotiations and carefully worded agreements. During the 1960s and 1970s, city officials and Bears leadership engaged in long, discreet talks over funding, renovation plans, and long-term control of the venue. Publicly, these discussions were framed as necessary improvements. Privately, they involved millions of dollars, political favors, and strategic compromises. As television money exploded in the 1970s, particularly after landmark broadcast deals following the NFL-AFL merger in 1970, the stakes grew higher. Commissioners such as Pete Rozelle, who led the league from 1960 to 1989, wielded enormous influence. Rozelle was widely praised for transforming the NFL into a polished, unified brand, but his leadership style also depended heavily on discretion and centralized authority. Owners trusted him to manage crises quietly, often away from public scrutiny. Journalists who attempted to investigate the darker side of this growth occasionally encountered resistance. In Chicago, a handful of investigative reporters began to circulate rumors of favoritism in contract negotiations, pressure placed on city councils, and financial arrangements that never appeared in official records. While few of these allegations were ever proven conclusively, their persistence suggested that the public narrative told only part of the story. Soldier Field, with its maze of internal corridors and restricted access areas, became a symbol of that hidden world. Former stadium employees later recalled that not all parts of Soldier Field were treated equally during renovations. While seating areas, locker rooms, and press facilities underwent visible upgrades, certain subterranean tunnels, technical rooms, and sealed-off chambers remained untouched for decades. These areas, largely invisible to fans, were known only to maintenance crews, security personnel, and select administrators. Some claimed these spaces dated back to the original construction in the early 1920s and had been intentionally preserved, either for structural reasons or for purposes never clearly explained. During the 1980s, as player salaries soared and endorsement deals turned athletes into global celebrities, reports of psychological pressure placed on players began to surface more openly across the league. In Chicago, former Bears players spoke privately about an atmosphere of relentless expectation, where performance was tied not only to contracts, but to unspoken obligations. Decisions about playing injured, remaining silent on internal issues, or accepting unfavorable terms were often framed as matters of loyalty to the team and the city. Some insiders suggested that Soldier Field itself played a role in this dynamic. The weight of history, the memorial origins, and the constant invocation of sacrifice were subtly woven into the culture surrounding the team. Players were reminded, sometimes explicitly, sometimes indirectly, that wearing a Bears uniform in that stadium meant carrying a burden greater than personal ambition. For certain athletes, this translated into motivation. For others, it became a source of anxiety and emotional strain. Alongside these pressures, stories circulated of symbolic gestures and rituals performed before important games or meetings. These were not described as overtly religious or supernatural, but rather as traditions meant to reinforce unity, discipline, and control. Closed-door gatherings, carefully choreographed speeches, and moments of silence took on a gravity that felt disproportionate to sport alone. Whether these practices were merely psychological tools or something more, opinions varied depending on who was asked. What remained consistent was the culture of silence. From the 1950s through the late 1980s, the NFL perfected its ability to manage narratives. Scandals were contained, disputes were settled quietly, and controversies rarely lingered long enough to threaten the league's image. In Chicago, when questions arose about financial transparency, renovation costs, or behind-the-scenes influence, official statements were brief and carefully constructed. The spectacle on the field always took precedence, diverting attention away from administrative shadows. By the time the 1990s approached, Soldier Field stood as a paradox. It was both a beloved landmark and a controlled environment shaped by decades of private decisions. Fans saw touchdowns, championships, and legendary performances. What they did not see were the layers of negotiation, compromise, and authority that had accumulated beneath the surface. To many observers, football at Soldier Field was no longer just a game. It was the visible expression of a vast structure of power, one where money flowed freely, decisions were made quietly, and history was selectively remembered. The roar of the crowd masked the whispers of the past, but they never fully disappeared. In the end, Soldier Field remained what it had always been, a place where symbolism mattered, where sacrifice was invoked, and where the boundaries between sport, politics, and control were deliberately blurred. The grass on the field changed, the players came and went, and the league grew richer with every passing year. Yet behind the spectacle, the same questions lingered about who truly held power, what deals were made in silence, and how much of the story was ever meant to be told. As the 1990s unfolded, the quiet machinery that had been operating behind the scenes at Soldier Field for decades did not slow down, it adapted. The world around the NFL was changing rapidly. Cable television exploded, sports networks ran 24 hours a day, and football was no longer confined to Sunday afternoons. It became a permanent presence in American culture, and with that visibility came even greater financial power. Soldier Field, standing along the shoreline of Lake Michigan, remained both a stage and a vault, open to the public on game days, sealed tight when the lights went out. The death of George Halas in October 1983 had marked the end of an era, but it did not weaken the structures he helped build. Control of the Chicago Bears passed to his descendants, and the franchise continued to operate with a deep sense of institutional loyalty and internal discipline. By the early 1990s, the NFL had become a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, and the league office, now under Commissioner Paul Tagliabue, exerted influence that extended far beyond sports. Stadiums were no longer just venues. They were leverage points in negotiations involving cities, states, corporations, and media conglomerates. In Chicago, this reality collided directly with Soldier Field's aging structure. While newer stadiums across the country were being built with luxury suites, private clubs, and massive sponsorship spaces, Soldier Field remained bound by its historic status and memorial identity. Publicly, this was framed as a matter of preservation and respect. Privately, it created tension, Bears executives and city officials found themselves locked in prolonged discussions about modernization, revenue sharing, and long-term control of the franchise's future. Throughout the 1990s, these negotiations intensified. Closed-door meetings took place in City Hall, in private law offices in the Loop, and in corporate boardrooms far removed from the stands where fans cheered. The numbers involved were staggering. Television contracts signed in 1993 and 1998 reshaped the league's financial landscape, and teams that lacked modern facilities risked falling behind. Soldier Field, with its monumental columns and limited commercial space, was increasingly seen as both a treasure and a liability. Journalists once again attempted to pull back the curtain. Articles appeared questioning how renovation funds were allocated, why certain bids were favored, and how political alliances influenced decisions. The answers, when they came at all, were vague. Committees were formed, studies commissioned, and promises made to the public. Yet insiders later admitted that the most important decisions had already been settled elsewhere. By the turn of the millennium, the pressure reached a breaking point. In 2001, the Bears temporarily left Soldier Field to play at the University of Illinois Memorial Stadium in Champaign, while Soldier Field underwent its most dramatic transformation since its original construction. Officially, the renovation was described as a necessary modernization that would preserve the historic exterior while updating the interior for contemporary football. The project cost approximately $690 million, funded largely by public money through the Illinois Sports Facilities Authority. What emerged in 2003, when Soldier Field reopened, was a structure that shocked many observers. The sleek, modern interior, often compared to a spacecraft, stood in stark contrast to the classical columns that surrounded it. Critics accused the city of desecrating a historic landmark. Preservationists were outraged, and in 2006, Soldier Field lost its designation as a National Historic Landmark, a rare and symbolic rebuke. Yet amid the architectural controversy, quieter conversations continued. Former construction workers and maintenance staff later spoke of areas within the stadium that remained unchanged, despite the massive overhaul. Certain underground passages, utility corridors, and sealed rooms were reportedly left intact, either due to structural constraints or by explicit instruction. These spaces, rarely discussed publicly, fueled speculation that not everything within Soldier Field was meant to be exposed or altered. Meanwhile, the culture of pressure within the NFL intensified. Players in the modern era faced scrutiny not only from coaches and owners, but from media, sponsors, and millions of fans watching in real time. In Chicago, the weight of playing at Soldier Field, already legendary for its wind, cold, and unforgiving turf, was compounded by expectations rooted in history. Former players from the late 1990s and early 2000s described an environment where tradition was used as both inspiration and obligation. To fail was not merely to lose a game, but to fall short of something larger, older, and deeply ingrained. As the league entered the 2010s, new scandals elsewhere in the NFL, ranging from player safety controversies to officiating manipulation accusations, cast a retrospective light on earlier decades of silence. Fans began to ask questions not only about the present, but about the past. How much had been hidden to protect the league's image? How many decisions had been made in rooms without windows, far from public accountability? Soldier Field stood quietly through it all. On game days, it remained alive with sound and emotion. The national anthem echoed beneath the columns. Fighter jets roared overhead, and the crowd erupted in familiar ritual. But when the stadium emptied, when the lights dimmed and the wind rolled in from Lake Michigan, it returned to its other identity, a place shaped by memory, authority, and unresolved history. Today, Soldier Field exists as a convergence point of multiple eras. It is at once a war memorial conceived in 1919, a football cathedral forged in the 1930s, a political asset manipulated during the Cold War years, and a modern entertainment venue struggling to reconcile its past with the demands of the present. Few places in American sports carry such layered meaning. What remains most striking is not any single rumor or allegation, but the continuity of discretion. Across generations of commissioners, owners, and officials, the same instinct prevailed. Protect the institution, control the narrative, and keep certain doors closed. The NFL's success was built not only on athletic excellence, but on its ability to manage perception. In that sense, Soldier Field is more than concrete and steel. It is a witness. It has watched soldiers be honored and forgotten, athletes celebrated and discarded, fortunes negotiated and concealed. It has absorbed the cheers of championships and the silence of unanswered questions. And while fans may come and go, believing they know the full story, the stadium remains, holding on to its secrets, unmoved by time, standing firm against the lake, as it always has. If you've made it this far, it's because something in these stories pulled you in. The feeling that behind every bright stadium light, every roaring crowd, and every celebrated touchdown, there is another layer that most people never see. The NFL presents itself as spectacle and tradition, but its true history is written in quiet rooms, in late-night decisions, in moments that never make the highlight reels. From iconic places like Soldier Field in Chicago, where generations of fans have gathered since its opening in 1924, to the powerful figures who shaped the league's destiny far from the public eye, there are stories that rarely get told and questions that were never meant to be asked. This channel exists to bring those hidden narratives into the open, to connect dates, locations, people, and real events into stories that feel alive, human, and sometimes unsettling. So if you want to keep uncovering the most disturbing, mysterious, and little-known chapters of the NFL, stories that unfold long after the cameras are turned off and the stadiums fall silent, subscribe to the channel now. Because here, the game doesn't end when the final whistle blows. Here, we go deeper into the shadows and reveal what truly happens behind the scenes. Because at Soldier Field, football has never been just football. It has always been a reflection of something deeper: the cost of power, the price of silence, and the enduring tension between what is seen and what is deliberately kept in the shadows. In the 21st century, Soldier Field stands as a contradiction carved into concrete and glass. From a distance, it appears modern, efficient, and aligned with the demands of contemporary professional sports. Yet anyone who knows its history understands that the stadium's essence was never erased, only reshaped. When Soldier Field reopened in September 2003, after a massive renovation project that began in 2001, it immediately became one of the most debated stadiums in the United States. Critics, architects, historians, and fans struggled to describe what they were seeing. Some called it progress. Others called it vandalism. The most enduring nickname captured the tension perfectly: a spaceship landed inside an ancient temple. The renovation, which cost nearly $690 million, was overseen by the Illinois Sports Facilities Authority and supported by city leaders who argued that modernization was essential if Chicago wanted to keep the Bears competitive in an NFL driven by luxury suites, premium seating, and broadcast revenue. The exterior colonnades, symbols of memory, sacrifice, and classical permanence, were preserved. Inside them, however, rose a sleek, asymmetrical structure of steel and glass, designed to maximize revenue rather than reverence. In trying to honor the past while serving the present, Soldier Field became visually divided, as if two eras were permanently at odds with each other. That division quickly took on symbolic meaning. Almost immediately after the reopening, Soldier Field lost its designation as a National Historic Landmark in 2006, an unprecedented decision that reflected how deeply controversial the transformation had been. For many Chicagoans, this moment felt like a rupture, not just architectural, but cultural. A stadium originally built to honor fallen soldiers had been fundamentally altered to meet the financial logic of modern professional sports. To some, that felt like evolution. To others, it felt like betrayal. On the field, the Chicago Bears entered the new century with hope, but also with familiar frustration. Despite moments of promise, such as the Bears' run to Super Bowl XLI in the 2006 season under head coach Lovie Smith, the team struggled to find consistency. Coaching changes came and went. Quarterbacks failed to meet expectations. Front office decisions were repeatedly questioned by fans and analysts alike. Seasons often began with optimism and ended in disappointment, reinforcing a growing sense that something was perpetually missing. Among longtime supporters, a particular narrative began to resurface. Older fans, some of whom had attended games before the renovation, spoke of Soldier Field as if it were a living entity, something that demanded respect and exacted consequences. Younger fans, raised in the era of modern stadiums, laughed at the idea at first. But over time, even they began to describe an atmosphere unlike any other venue in the league. The cold winds off Lake Michigan, the uneven turf, the harsh lighting, and the sheer weight of history combined to create an experience that many found emotionally draining rather than energizing. Former players added their voices quietly. In interviews given years after retirement, some Bears players from the 2000s and 2010s described a sense of pressure that went beyond normal professional expectations. They spoke of playing not just for a team, but for a symbol, one tied to war, sacrifice, and a city that prided itself on toughness. While such narratives are often romanticized in sports culture, several athletes hinted that the psychological burden could become overwhelming. Injuries lingered, confidence eroded. Momentum was hard to sustain. Even some stadium employees, security staff, maintenance workers, and event personnel have described Soldier Field as emotionally oppressive during quiet hours. When the crowds leave and the stadium empties, the silence feels heavy rather than peaceful. Long corridors, some dating back to the original 1920s construction, remain largely unchanged beneath the modern structure. The contrast between the renovated public spaces and the older, restricted areas only deepens the sense that the stadium is layered with unresolved history. This is where interpretation begins to split. For skeptics, everything about Soldier Field can be explained rationally. The Bears' struggles reflect poor management decisions, not supernatural forces. The stadium's atmosphere is a product of weather, design flaws, and the psychological pressure of playing in a historically demanding city. The idea of a curse is dismissed as narrative convenience, a way for fans to cope with disappointment. Others take a more nuanced view. They argue that Soldier Field's origins as a war memorial, combined with decades of institutional pressure, silence, and expectation, created a psychological environment that affects everyone who enters it. In this interpretation, the stadium doesn't need to be cursed in a mystical sense. Its power lies in symbolism. From the national anthem ceremonies to the constant invocation of legacy and sacrifice, Soldier Field reinforces the idea that failure carries moral weight. Not every athlete thrives under that burden. And then there is a third perspective, one that looks beyond emotion and into structure. From this angle, Soldier Field is a case study in how the NFL builds and maintains its empire. The stadium represents the intersection of public money, private profit, political negotiation, and controlled storytelling. Decisions about renovations, staffing, branding, and long-term franchise direction were never made solely with fans or players in mind. They were made to protect the league's image, ensure revenue streams, and preserve authority. In that context, Soldier Field's contradictions are not accidents, they are features. The modern NFL thrives on spectacle, but it is sustained by silence. Controversies rise and fall quickly. Narratives are shaped, reframed, or buried. Fans are encouraged to focus on the field while power operates elsewhere. Soldier Field, with its preserved facade and altered core, mirrors that strategy perfectly. What is visible honors tradition. What truly matters operates behind the walls. Today, as debates continue about whether the Bears should leave Soldier Field for a new stadium elsewhere, perhaps in Arlington Heights or another suburban location, the questions surrounding the venue grow louder. Would leaving finally free the franchise from decades of frustration? Or would it sever the last tangible connection to a history that, for better or worse, defined the team? There is no definitive answer. What remains is uncertainty, and that uncertainty is precisely what keeps the story alive. Soldier Field endures not because it is perfect, but because it is unresolved. It invites interpretation, suspicion, and reflection. Is it cursed by its origins, shaped by psychological legacy, or simply a monument to how power operates quietly in modern sports? Perhaps it is all of these things at once. In the end, Soldier Field is more than a stadium. It is a symbol layered with memory, ambition, sacrifice, and control. It reflects the evolution of the NFL itself, from a rough regional league to a global corporation. And as long as the Bears continue to play on that wind-swept patch of ground beside Lake Michigan, the question will remain unanswered. Because some stories do not survive by being solved, they survive by being questioned. If you feel that football is more than what appears on the surface, if you've ever sensed that some stadiums carry stories far heavier than the cheers of the crowd, then this is an invitation made especially for you. The National Football League, celebrated worldwide for its spectacle, glory, and larger-than-life heroes, also hides layers that rarely reach the spotlight. Behind the roaring fans, the perfectly trimmed fields, and the carefully scripted broadcasts, there are corridors few dare to talk about, decisions made in silence, and moments erased before they ever became headlines. From historic places like Soldier Field in Chicago, inaugurated in 1924 as a memorial to fallen soldiers, to other legendary stadiums scattered across the United States, the NFL has been shaped not only by touchdowns and championships, but also by pressure, sacrifice, fear, ambition, and power. Men like George Halas, pioneers who helped build the league in its earliest years, understood that what happened off the field could be just as decisive as what unfolded during the game. Over the decades, as the league grew into a billion-dollar empire, many stories were left behind, whispered only among players, staff members, and insiders who witnessed things they were never encouraged to share. This channel exists to bring those stories back into the light. Not to sensationalize, but to understand. Not to accuse recklessly, but to connect the dots that history often leaves scattered. Here, we talk about the games you watched on Sundays, but also about what happened on Monday mornings in closed offices. We revisit seasons that seemed cursed, careers that collapsed without explanation, and franchises that carried an invisible weight year after year. We explore how certain moments in NFL history coincided with personal tragedies, controversial decisions, and events that mysteriously vanished from the public narrative. When the final whistle blows and the stadium lights go dark, that is when the real stories often begin. In empty locker rooms, underground tunnels, and boardrooms far from the cameras, choices are made that shape destinies, franchises, and sometimes entire cities. These are not myths invented for clicks, but accounts rooted in real places, real people, and real dates, stitched together through research, memory, and voices that were never meant to be heard by the masses. If you are someone who wants to go beyond the surface, who believes that the history of the NFL is incomplete without its shadows, then this is where you belong. By subscribing to the channel, you become part of a community that values curiosity, depth, and truth. A place where the game doesn't end when the clock hits zero, and where the most unsettling chapters are not ignored, but carefully uncovered and told as they deserve to be told. So take a step beyond the highlight reels. Join us, subscribe to the channel, and walk with us into the hidden side of the NFL, where every legend has a backstory, every stadium has a memory, and every silence tells a story waiting to be revealed.